Now, the prevalence of gun battles between police and criminals has yet again been brought to the fore. Concerns expressed by organizations including Gunfree South Africa on the amount of guns in the hands of civilians and criminals in South Africa. Let's unpack the story further. We're joined this afternoon by Claire Taylor, who is a researcher at Gunfree South Africa. Claire, it's great to have you on the program. Thanks very much indeed for your time. We've got so many stories in our headlines this afternoon involving guns, the shootout in Marion Hill, the shooting of an ANC councillor in KwaZulu-Natal as well. Where do these guns come from?
So to just contextualize these killings that you've referred to, is that 34 people are shot dead every day in this country. So we have a crisis of gun violence and we need urgent action. We know that there are approximately 5 million licensed guns in this country, of which 2.8 million are owned by citizens and the remainder are owned by the state. The guns that are used in the killings that you referred to, not obviously the police killing criminals, but the criminals' guns, these are most likely illegal guns. In the majority of cases, they are unlicensed guns. But the biggest source of unlicensed guns in South Africa are licensed gun owners. So it's citizens and the police. And to give you an indication, last year the police released statistics on gun loss and theft. And they showed that on average, citizens report the loss or theft of 23 guns every day in this country. And the police report the loss or theft of 2 guns every day. So licensed guns in this country are the biggest source of illegal guns that are arming criminals.
I mean, that's shocking, isn't it? So 5 million licensed guns, and by the numbers that you're giving us, citizens losing 23 guns a day. These are licensed and legal guns. Police losing 2 guns to loss or theft. It's not a new issue, is it?
It isn't, and it's really concerning that government isn't taking silencing the guns seriously. And there are interventions that can be taken to help protect lives. South Africa has already seen the impact of reducing availability of guns when a new gun law was passed in 2000 and was strictly implemented. And what we saw was a halving of our gun death rate. From 34 people shot and killed a day, exactly what we have now, it dropped down to 18 people, which is still very high, but we're back to levels that we had in the late 1990s. And so we need urgent action to reduce the availability of guns. To just say that when we spoke about police guns being stolen, these are guns that are stolen from police members who are on duty. Mm-hmm. There are also guns that are stolen from SAP's 13 stores, SAP's evidence stores. And the info that we have available, this was in a parliamentary reply, was that 357 guns were stolen from police stores in the last 5 years. But of course, we mustn't forget Chris Prinsloo. He was a corrupt police official who was in charge of a weapons store in which weapons that were destined for destruction were being kept until they were destroyed. And he stole, there are debates about how many guns he stole. He admitted to stealing 2,700 guns from these stores and selling them to criminals on the Cape Flats. And those guns have now been found to have killed a number. We've got evidence of them having killed a number of children and injuring and disabling a number of children. And so Gunfree South Africa has instituted a class action proceedings against the Minister of Police to hold him accountable for not safeguarding those weapons and communities in the Western Cape.
Yeah, and Chris Prinsloo in 2023 benefited from that special remission of sentence, right? And I imagine this is something that Gunfree South Africa will also be taking on. I mean, this is someone who very obviously putting guns in the hands of essentially gangsters on the Cape Flats has blood on his hands.
Absolutely. But so does the police force as a whole, that they didn't put systems in place to ensure that these guns were in safe storage and were in fact destroyed. They had no way of knowing that these guns had been stolen. There was no, I mean, in their court papers, they claimed that there are all these systems in place to safeguard weapons. This is in response to the class action proceedings that Gunfree South Africa has instituted. And it's clear that those processes may be in place on paper, but they weren't in fact being implemented. And so we do need to put in place systems to ensure that all licensed weapon stocks, be they held by civilians, be they held by the state, including the police, and the private security company, are regularly audited, and mechanisms put in place to stop them leaking into criminals' hands.
I mean, the question obviously becomes clear. Chris Prinsloo was one person who was convicted of this. One just wonders, given the amount of police guns in the hands of criminals, whether this is still happening.
So we know that it is still happening, even if you just look at the figures of police members who are shot and killed and their weapons stolen. And what is interesting looking at those figures is that more police members are killed when they are off duty than when they are on duty. And although information isn't always made available, it's clear that in many of those cases, even when they're off duty, they're killed and then their service pistol is stolen from them. And so Gunfree South Africa has been urging governments to in fact comply with the Firearms Control Act, which is clear, is that police members, when they go off duty, should not be allowed to take their service guns home with them, because it's a risk. It's a risk for them being targeted for their gun. But also, if you look at domestic violence-related killings, police members are at much higher risk of killing their intimate partner than are people who aren't involved in law enforcement and security. And so it's a way of protecting family members. And of course, there's always the risk of suicide. And when a gun is involved, it is so much more lethal. And so it's also a way of protecting police members from suicide. And so Gunfree South Africa repeats the call that the Firearms Control Act is clear. When police members go off duty, they need to leave their service guns at work. And that has not been complied by SAPS. And that would be one way of protecting citizens.
And just so many issues around what you're describing here, the benefits of actually implementing that part of the Firearms Control Act. Let me ask you this, Claire. In terms of, getting illegal guns off the street, we've had this in the past where we've had an amnesty period. So, you've been able to hand in a gun that's in your possession that is not licensed to you without any questions asked. How successful was that? And is that one way of dealing with this issue?
So in fact, the amnesties that we have had do ask questions. And that's one of the criticisms that Gunfree South Africa has, is that if you are serious about removing guns off the street, you need to have a blanket amnesty where anyone who has access to an unlicensed or illegal gun can hand it in with no questions asked, because the focus then is on removing these guns from communities. And to give you an indication, one of the guns that Chris Prinsloo stole and sold to gang leaders on the Western Cape has been found to have been used to murder 19 people. So if you can remove one gun, you can potentially save many, many lives. So in fact, we do need to focus on blanket amnesties. But in terms of success, they are very successful. And it goes back to the point that we were talking about at the beginning of this interview. The biggest source of illegal guns in South Africa is licensed weapons owned by civilians and the state. And so amnesties are a way of recovering guns that are unwanted. For example, estate firearms. When somebody dies, there's sometimes a firearm in the estate, and people have this. They don't reapply for a license. It's essentially an illegal gun. They don't know what to do with it. They're not storing it correctly. They don't have the necessary knowledge around the law. And so an amnesty is a way of handing that gun in, which reduces the risk that it will be lost or stolen. That said, incidents like Prinsloo highlight the importance of the police taking measures to take the public into their confidence and to build trust in the police. So, for example, Gunfree South Africa has urged the police to explore the feasibility of implementing technology where a gun that's handed in during an amnesty is actually destroyed in front of the person, so that the person knows that it will not then leak from police stores into communities. And the police need to build the trust that the public have, particularly people who've got firearms, that those guns aren't going to leak back into criminals' hands and be used to kill or injure innocent people.
You know, given everything you've said about a gun getting into the wrong hands, just one single gun and the kind of damage that can do, you know, South Africans may be more inclined, given the current crime situation in our country, to get a gun as a way of protecting their own families. What would be the advice from Gunfree South Africa, just given everything you've said about the correct storage of a gun, the domestic violence rate in our country? How often is actually acquiring a gun a real measure to keep me and my family safe?
So my advice to anyone thinking about getting a firearm for self-protection is to do your homework and to really research the risks associated with a gun. The evidence overwhelmingly in South Africa and globally shows that a gun is not effective for self-defense. And this is because criminals choose the time and place of attack to ensure that their victim is outnumbered and vulnerable. And in that situation, the risk is that if you try and use your firearm, that you'll get shot. And evidence in South Africa shows that you're 4 to 5 times more likely to be fired at if you pull your gun out during a crime situation. Evidence overseas confirms it's not only fired at, it's actually shot. You're 4 to 5 times more likely to be shot. But there are other risks that we've spoken about. You mentioned domestic violence, the increased risk of a domestic violence dispute turning into a murder when there's a firearm involved. There's, of course, the high risk of a child finding the firearm if it's not safely stored. And there's that tension between, I have a gun to protect myself and my family, but the Firearms Control Act says that the gun needs to be put in a safe. How am I then going to access my gun? And if it's not in a safe, what if my child finds it? Or what if it gets stolen and then used to commit crimes against other people?
You've certainly given us a lot to think about. Claire Taylor is a researcher at Gunfree South Africa. Thanks so much for joining us here on Daytime Update.